Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, hello. Coming out the speaker there, bit of echo. Don't want any of that nonsense. Hello there. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes, and you're the people listening, and I'm the one talking. Now, hopefully today I'll be in a better, relaxed state of mind to read a bit more proficiently to you than the last episode. Sorry about that. From yesterday, although I say a relaxed state of mind, my hands are cold. I've just been outside cutting logs, kindling for the Essie. I've got to light the Essie. As soon as I finish this, blessy the Essie. Blessy the Essie. Anyway, I hope you are all well. We are hopefully finishing today, with any luck. We will do our best. Children of the Archbishop by Norman Collins, which has been such an entertaining and thrilling book. Before we start, however, a couple of things to do. One is I've managed to get some lemons, so went shopping today. Forgot to buy more ginger, but I had enough, so that's all right. So good afternoon to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Michael White, to Holly and Co, to Steve G, to Les Jervis, to Linda Kane, to Billabong O'Neill, to Ed Loud, to Audrey Forbes, to Farmer Child. Here, you get off my land, you lubber. To who else have we got there? Dave Over Yonder, Lee Lawson, to Cooper68, Philip Hammond and Mary, lovely to see you. To Edward Moulding, to Stephen Agger, to John F, to Justine Jones, Dudley Sawyer, just back from a walk down to the seafront, mighty cold, blimey, and to James Poulton, who says, the brown man. Yes, I've got the, where is it? Is it on here or on the camera? On the monitor, no, it is on, it's there. Anyway, here we go again. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much. I'm just getting that ensconced, ready for the drink. Actually, I might take it out now. I think it's probably ready. Before we start. There we go. Do you know, I can feel something. It's just a bit of sleep or something, you know, a little bit of something has just gone into my eye. And I've only got the one. Don't you know? Yes, we all know, Richard. You don't have to say. Oh, okay, fair enough. Right, we're on chapter 60. I'm reading in Roman numerals. So, I hope you're all well and we're all good. You can hear me, presumably. Maybe a shopping list would be a good idea, says Linda Kane. Oh, you know. He's a man, Linda. Yes, he's a man. What do I want with a shopping list? I'm thinking of joining this book club I've heard about. I was reading this book the other day, and on the back page, there was this whole load of information about these books. That's the same one. I don't know whether they're available now, but they must have got some good books in there, because this was one. Anyway, here we go. Sweetie was improving rapidly. Dame Eleanor had put Sweetie's hair into the hands of a good hairdresser, and he had got some shape into it. But her eyelashes, without any help from the hairdresser, were every bit as good as her hair. Her eyes, deep and dark as a Madonna's, were really remarkable. The photograph of Sweetie that now stood on Dame Eleanor's dressing table showed what magnificent eyes they were. What was more important, however, was that Sweetie had outgrown her earlier restlessness. Even Margaret could see that she was settling down. It must have been a year since she had so much as mentioned ginger. There were, of course, sudden crazes, sillinesses. She wanted to travel, run a riding school, become a mannequin, be an air hostess. But that is the kind of thing to be expected from a girl when she's getting on for 18. Blimey. Years pass, don't they, in this? Years pass. And the real trouble was that she hadn't any friends. Dame Eleanor had done the best for her. She had invited some very nice girls, very nice girls from Cheltenham and Rodine, but it was no use. They wore the same kind of clothes, had the same kind of manners, spoke with the same voices even, now that Sweetie had been given elocution lessons. There, however, it stopped. They had nothing, apparently, in common. It was all too plain that Sweetie wasn't very much interested in girls. That is. As for Dame Eleanor, she wasn't very much interested in young men, not for the present at least. She changed her mind suddenly because of the young men whom Sweetie was meeting at the dance classes. It was a thoroughly select dance class. Oh, very select, as in, very select dance class, with none but the nicest young men attending it. But Dame Eleanor decided that they were probably neither select nor nice enough. Slowly, carefully, she began admitting a trickle of young men of her own choosing. They arrived at the Cedars pink, awkward, polite, self-conscious. They had an air of having been to Cheltenham and Rodine themselves, and Sweetie despised the lot of them. Good for Sweetie. The most persistent and one of the nicest of young men whom Dame Eleanor admitted to the house was James Sturgis, an old Admiral Sturgis's son. James Sturgis was in the Navy himself. He was not so pink and awkward as the others. Perhaps that was because he was older. He was 26. But the difference of a few years didn't matter. All to the good, in fact, Dame Eleanor considered. And, best of all, Sweetie seemed to like him. It was only Margaret who was worried. Dame Eleanor seemed to be taking so much for granted. She kept dropping stray remarks about it. "Couldn't get a steadier sort of man, James," she said. "Just what Sweetie needs, someone to keep her on the rails." And continuing with her thoughts, she added a moment later, "It's boy babies that always comes first with the Sturgises. 2 boys and a girl, I should know. I've seen 3 generations of them." And when Margaret asked Dame Eleanor if she ever thought that Sweetie was really in love with James Sturgis, Dame Eleanor shrugged her shoulders. "What does a girl of 18 know about love?" she asked. "She's pleased when he rings up, and that's the main thing." That night, Margaret spoke to Sweetie. Not that it was easy. During the past year, Sweetie had grown apart from her so much. She didn't seem to feel the need of her any more. Sweetie was seated at the dressing table, spreading cream on her face, when Margaret entered. "Oh, it's you," she said over her shoulder, and turned away again towards the mirror. Margaret waited. "I want to talk to you," she said at last. "What about?" "About this James Sturgis." Sweetie said nothing, but she raised her eyebrows. Margaret could see the gesture in the glass. "Are you in love with him?" Margaret asked. "Why do you want to know?" "I do." "Well, it's my business." "Yes, but it's mine too, Sweetie. I want you to be happy." Sweetie turned and faced her. "You may do now," she said, "but you didn't always." "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing." "Tell me." "Well, you wouldn't say where Ginger was, would you?" Sweetie demanded. "You wouldn't say just because you didn't like him. You've always hated Ginger." Margaret felt her nerves tightening. She got up and put her hand on Sweetie's shoulder. "Are you still in love with Ginger?" she asked. But Sweetie only thrust her hand away. "Why do you come here?" she asked. "You're only trying to gloat over me. Won't you leave me alone? I ask you, please, please go." Oh dear. Chapter 51. Canon Mallow, it's not 51, 61, beg your pardon, for those of you keeping count. Canon Mallow, rather to his own surprise when he came to think about it, had succeeded in his purpose. He had got rid of Miss Britt. Or rather, Miss Britt had done it for him. She could not, she said, even consider being criticised by anyone so unscientific as Canon Mallow. After Dr. Trump's departure, it seemed that she had remained at the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital only out of a keen sense of duty towards the children, and now that she knew that she was not appreciated, she would like to leave immediately. Then, rather illogically, for by now the volcanoes had melted, the main glacier, and everything was suddenly fluid and unpredictable, she added that if Dr. Trump had still been there, he would never have allowed it. It was obvious, as she said it, that she had admired the man, revered him, idolised him even in a chaste and chilly fashion, possibly loved him a little. But it was too late now to turn to Dr. Trump. In the P&O liner Sydney, Dr. Trump was already approaching Suez on his voyage towards his new brave life. Violently seasick for the first 5 days, he was now steadying himself with rusks and bowls of hot beef tea. And he was magnificently disdainful of infirmity. Even though it was hot, sweltering hot, in the little cabin, he was making no concessions to the climate. With his chair drawn up against the electric fan, he was busy with the QU dictionary, engrossed, in fact, absorbed in it. And every few minutes he would throw his head back and try to pronounce something. It doesn't actually say that, I just put that in for good measure. He had put in more than 2 hours' work already, but work was easy on board, at least comparatively easy. There were no interruptions from either Felicity or Sebastian. As far as they were concerned, they had all turned out just as Dr. Trump had indeeded. They had all turned out just as Dr. Trump had intended. They had stayed behind in Broadstairs. And so here he was, on the high seas, and practically a bachelor again, but only practically. He, as he sat there on the hard, upright chair with the Chinese textbook resting on the ledge of the wash basin. As he sat there on his high chair with the textbook on the wash basin, there came a knock at the door upon the cabin. Dr. Trump started and looked agonisingly round the room until his eyes faintly came to rest on the clothes closet. But it was no use. The knock had come a second time, and if he didn't answer, he knew in a moment the door handle would begin turning. Why, he asked himself despairingly, had Mrs. Warple been positively insisted to come along with him to Chungking? "Come in, mother dear," he said, finally. There was one other Ed Bodkinen who had already faced change, and all the anguish that it implied in its separation, and that was Mr. Pavarius, disgraced, shunned, ruined, a double outcast in ecclesiastical circles. He had just signed a 12-week contract with the Leicester Square Majestic. Admittedly, the hours were long, but the pay was reasonable, the same as the cabinet ministers, and he was allowed to play his own stuff. Mr. Spike Jerome had stipulated that when he fixed up the contract. At this very moment, Mr. Pavarius was on the job. Clothed in an all-white evening suit, he was seated at the console of a mammoth Wurlitzer that was illuminated like an incandescent bombe glacée. And the bombe glacée was rising from its pit, and a magenta light was being splayed on Mr. Pavarius from the projector room. And he was playing already as he came up, playing quietly, scarcely more than a whisper, in fact, and mournfully, and with soul. "Love's the divinest thing," the piece was called. It was his own latest number, and as he played it, he was thinking about his own divorce proceedings. It was Mr. Twiddle, not Desiree, who was in his mind, as the deep vibrations of the Wurlitzer brought lumps into the audience throat and started hands reaching for I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. It's a shame because it's the last line of that particular chapter. It was Mr. Twiddle, not Desiree, who was in his mind as the deep vibrations of the Wurlitzer brought lumps into the audience throat and started hands reaching out for hands everywhere from the 2s and 4s and the 9s and 6s. I got it. Got it a second reading. Got it second. Absolutely mastered it. Oh, I rocked it on that occasion. Sometimes, you just need to realise what he was talking about. It was the 4s and the 2s and 4s and the 9s and 6s. And I realised, they're the seats. Of course. What was that? Bit of something. Anyway, chapter 62, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Pavarius deserves his own book. He certainly does. It is interesting, isn't it? You see these characters and you think, yes, all these lives that in these could be in different books, but then they might beget characters who also could be in other books. I wonder if that's ever happened. I bet it has. I bet there's an author out there who's created first book, and then from that, basically, it's like a germ pool, and each one has suddenly, like you'd have a Bible to go, this begat the... Well, wasn't that the Bible? Didn't the Bible have books in it? This begat him, and he begat her. It was Dame Eleanor's idea that Sweetie should be given a coming out party, and it was her 18th birthday that was chosen for it. Dame Eleanor, because coming out now might have a different meaning these days. Dame Eleanor's giving you a new dress for it, Margaret told Sweetie. It's going to be a white one. She was pleased nowadays that she was able to tell Sweetie something. It showed that she was still in Dame Eleanor's confidence. But Sweetie only smiled. I know, she said, she told me. And then she turned to Margaret. What are you going to wear? She asked. Margaret shrugged her shoulders. Oh, don't worry about me, she said. I'll be too busy doing things to worry about what I'm going to wear. Have you got a party dress? Sweetie asked. Margaret paused. Not for that kind of party, she said. Sweetie would not be put off, however. Borrow the blue one of the cook's, she told her. You'll look very nice in it. You're both about the same size. She paused. And I've told you before, she went on. It's really silly of you, really it is, to give me birthday presents when you haven't got enough clothes for all you want. You're too generous, that's the trouble with you. I want you to promise now that if ever I get married, you're not going to give me a wedding present. Margaret smiled. I'm not going to promise you anything, she told her. It's too early. You'll be glad of it by then. You never know. But there she checked herself. What she had said now surprised her. The words had come from nowhere, and she didn't know why she had said it. Sweetie, however, hadn't taken them seriously. She was only laughing at her. I believe you'd like to see me poor again, she said. Then you could do everything for me. And going up to Margaret, she kissed her. It was not often these days that Margaret kissed her. It was not often these days that Sweetie kissed her. She seemed to have outgrown that sort of thing, and at the party Margaret could see just how grown up she really was. She was a young woman, and it was wonderful watching all these people with Sweetie at the centre. James Sturgis was close beside her, and she was smiling at everyone. I needn't have worried, Margaret told herself. It's going to be all right. It'll all turn out just as I hoped. Against the far wall, Dame Eleanor was seated on the couch alongside Admiral Sturgis. And she's 1 in 1,000, she was saying. Whoever gets her is going to be lucky. The Admiral was non-committal. Damn pretty girl, he replied. Don't wonder he'll fall for her. Would have done so myself. He was, as a matter of fact, still disappointed, and more than disappointed, fairly bowled over by the fact that his son should have picked on a girl with no background. It seemed a sort of slight, somehow, on himself and the boy's mother. But he didn't want to start a row with Dame Eleanor this evening, so he merely repeated himself. Damn pretty girl. Don't know that I've ever seen anyone prettier. Or happier? Dame Eleanor reminded him. She had sensed a feeling of reserve somewhere, and she didn't like it. Both of them, I mean. They're cut out for each other. And it was Canon's Mallow view too that Sweetie was the happiest girl, as well as the prettiest girl, that he had ever seen. He pottered around the room telling everyone, and he went further with Sweetie. He insisted on kissing her. "And isn't it the first time I've done it? And it isn't the first time I've done it either," he said smilingly. "I kissed you when you were only so big." He spread his hands out, indicating something the size of a lapdog. "That was just after you'd been brought in. I remember. It was a terrible night. The rain was coming down." And then he recollected that the one thing that he mustn't do was to remember. Then he recollected the one thing that he mustn't do was to remember. It was the only condition, that he did not refer to Sweetie's earlier life in the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital, and certainly not in front of the Sturgises, that Dame Eleanor had invited him at all, on that one condition. Canon Mallow heaved a deep sigh of sheer physical relief when he got back to Mr. Jeff Cott's old room. "Ah," he said to himself as he pushed his shoes off and slid into his bedroom slippers. "That's better. Now I can breathe again." He had never been much of a man for parties, and he'd been thoroughly glad when it had been time to leave the Cedars. Of course, he was delighted by the way things had turned out for her. It was wonderful, simply wonderful, or at least he supposed it was wonderful. Everyone else seemed to think it was. But now that he came to reflect on it, he was not so sure, and the longer he sat there, blowing out blue, lazy clouds of smoke and thinking things over, the more he found that he was convincing himself the other way. "You can't help wondering," he told himself, "really can't help wondering." The habit of addressing himself in the second person had grown on him since his retirement. Sometimes he carried on whole conversations as though he were only in partial agreement with the other part of him that was thinking. "You never can tell," he went on. "It might have been better if Margaret hadn't bothered so much about her. A girl's got to stand on her own feet sometime, and most of my girls have been very happy in domestic service, provided they got into the right sort of family, of course. They like the feeling of being on their own." He paused and pressed down the tobacco in his pipe with the flat side of a matchbox. "You might say it's the chance of a lifetime if she marries that naval fellow. But he'll never understand her. I can't imagine what Dame Eleanor is thinking about allowing it. Now, that other chap, what do you call him? The one with the red hair. He would have understood her. And she might have liked him at one time, and she must have liked him at one time, or they'd never have gone off together." Here Canon Mallow shook a head sadly. "I still think it would have turned out better if it hadn't have been the naval fella. I do. I do. If only I'd thought of it earlier. I could have done something. I could have told Dame Eleanor, or Margaret, or Sweetie. I tried to have stopped it. Say what you will, that's what I ought to have done. I ought to have tried to stop it." But when he realised that it was the unpopular view, nobody would ever forgive him if he mentioned it, and in any case it was too late now. Not that this surprised him. All his life he had been leaving things too late. Not so his predecessor. Dr. Trump was now busy making Chinese history. Already he'd been able to report unprecedented boom in Bible sales and over 700 conversions in the Chongqing postal area alone. The most remarkable conversion of all, however, was one to which Dr. Trump had not even referred. But Felicity spotted it. The last issue of the Mission magazine, unfortunately printed throughout in Chinese characters, which meant that she could not read what it said, contained a picture of her own mother. Actually, it was Sebastian who spotted it. "Look, Granny," he said, and Felicity looked, and there was Mrs. Worple, wearing a plain cotton dress. She had discarded her pearls and earrings and was distributing what appeared to be hymn sheets. Remembering the difficulty that Bishop Worple had experienced in getting his wife along even to choral evensong at home, Felicity felt that she had gravely underestimated her husband, and secretly she was jealous. The very moment Sebastian's chest was strong enough, she promised herself that she would go out to Chungking to be beside her husband, cherish him, make him happy, win him back again. Chapter 63. You're not your own master in the Royal Navy. Until you are on half pay and retired, things like private life and getting married and having to take second place... you're not... It's the way he puts full stops in, which clearly is a sentence, but he interrupts his sentences with full stops. You're not your own master in the Navy until you are on half pay and retired. Until you are on half pay and retired, things like private life and getting married seem to have taken second place besides postings overseas. And it was Lieutenant Sturgis' sudden posting to Malta that threatened to upset everything, or rather would have upset it if Dame Eleanor had not intervened. But she was adamant. Mediterranean fleet or no Mediterranean fleet, she was not going to see something settled before James went off anywhere. And when she found that Admiral Sturgis was inclined to the other view and to postpone things until he got back, she required no more persuasion. Not that young James seemed reluctant. It was simply that Dame Eleanor would have taken a better view of him if he had insisted. She disliked seeing men in their late 20s completely under the thumb of their fathers, and she told him so. Frankly, she would have preferred him to be just a bit more impulsive. "You and Sweetie seem to be very much interested in one another," she said to him. If you want to get engaged to her before you go off, I shan't put any obstacles in your way." James Sturgis did not reply immediately. "It's not me," he said. "It's Sweetie. I've asked her, you know." "And she's refused you?" "Sort of," he admitted. "She says she wants time to think about it." Dame Eleanor drew in her lips. "Leave this to me," she said. She sent for Sweetie the same evening. She wasn't well, and she had to brace herself for what she was going to say. But it was in Sweetie's interests that she was doing it. She was sure of that. "Now listen, dear," she told her. "Nobody's trying to make you do anything you don't want to do. It's only your happiness I'm thinking of." She paused. "But James Sturgis is a very nice boy, remember, and he comes from good family. He's absolutely devoted to you, and he isn't the sort of fella that falls in love easily. You could do a lot worse than James, you know." "I know I could," Sweetie answered. "He's always been nice to me." There was something in Sweetie's reply that annoyed Dame Eleanor. "And let me tell you something else, my girl," she went on. "It isn't everybody who would want to marry you, either. It's all very well being pretty and that kind of thing, but it counts for something having family behind you. I've done what I could do. I've done what I could to give you a background, but it isn't the same thing. Some people put a lot of store by family." James doesn't. He told me so. "And I've told him what you've told me." Sorry, I'm just lost with who's saying what. "But it isn't the same thing. Some people put a lot of store by family." "James doesn't. He told me so." "Have you discussed it with him?" "I told him just what you've told me now," Sweetie answered. "I was warning him." "And he still wants to marry you?" Sweetie nodded. "Then why don't you accept him?" Dame Eleanor leant over and patted Sweetie's hand. "Don't you understand, dear? It's what I've been hoping for. I want to see you married, with your own family of your own. I want to see grandchildren." The word had slipped out unintentionally, but she didn't correct it. Instead, she went on quietly. "Think it over tonight, dear, and pray and pray. It's always a great help praying when you're worried. And tell me the answer in the morning." It was late now, really late. Dame Eleanor had put down more than 2 hours. It was late now. Dame Eleanor had been put down more than 2 hours since, and all the servants had gone to bed long ago. Margaret was not asleep, however. She had just lain awake, staring up at the ceiling ever since she'd gone to the bed. She'd thought a lot. Remembered much too, cried once or twice, and prayed a little. "Oh God, forgive me for everything," she had just said. "And let it be the right thing that I am doing now. Make her love him more than she does. Otherwise she won't be happy. She's a good girl, really she is. Please, God, let her be happy. Don't let her do what I did. It's all worked out so wonderfully up to the present, thanks to you, God. Please don't let anything start going wrong now." She heard the clock in the hall strike midnight, and then she got up. She decided to go down and kiss Sweetie good night. It was something that she'd always done when Sweetie had first come here. Sweetie didn't know about it, but Margaret had often kissed her good night without waking her. Going over to the wardrobe, she took out her dressing gown. It was a thick dressing gown, an old one of Dame Eleanor's. It made her look fat and shapeless. Her bedroom slippers were old too. She had bought those for herself, cheaply. They were loose over the instep already, and the soles made a dragging sound as she walked. But it was late, and she would meet no one, so she took no trouble with her hair. While she'd been tossing in bed, it had become unplaited at the ends, and she thrust it into the collar of her dressing gown. It was still rich, plentiful hair, but it was becoming streaked with grey by now. "I'll just kiss her good night, and then I'll go back to bed," she told herself. When she reached Sweetie's room, however, she saw that the light was on, and she waited outside the door, undecided. Sweetie was so independent these days that perhaps she wouldn't like Margaret coming down to see her at this time of night. "But I must go in," she told herself at last. "Perhaps she's worrying about what Dame Eleanor had said to her." She turned the handle of the door gently. Oh, there's somebody at the front door now. I think it's an Amazon delivery for Billy. And he's going to get it. That's lucky. Where were we? She was on a... Yes, she turned the handle of the door. Sweetie was... Oh, yes, she may not like it. "But I must go in. Perhaps she's worrying." She turned the handle of the door gently. Sweetie was kneeling in front of the fireplace, with a writing case open on the rug beside her. Margaret did not go over to her at once. "Sweetie," she said, standing over by the door. "Sweetie." Sweetie turned suddenly, and as she turned, Margaret saw just how pale she was. She suddenly looked as young again as on the first day that Margaret had brought her there. "You frightened me coming in like that," Sweetie said. While she was speaking, she was shutting up the writing case, trying to conceal what it contained. "I couldn't go to sleep," Margaret told her. "I was thinking about you, so I thought I'd come down." "I'm so glad you've come," Sweetie said slowly. "I needed someone." Margaret came over to her. "What's the matter, Sweetie?" she asked at last. But Sweetie only shook her head. "It's nothing I can describe. You'd better tell me. You wouldn't understand. Nobody would, not even you." Margaret put her arm on her shoulder. "Perhaps I understand more than you think." Sweetie looked up at her, puzzled. "Not about this," she said. Is it that you're not in love with James? Margaret asked her. Sweetie didn't answer immediately, but Margaret could feel her body stiffen as she heard the question. I love him, all right, she said at last. It's just that I love Ginger more. I wasn't going to tell you, but you might as well know. I love Ginger more than I ever love anybody. Margaret drew her breath in quickly. It was Sweetie this time who could feel the sudden involuntary movement of the other person. You haven't been seeing him, have you? Sweetie shook her head. That's what makes it so dreadful. And do you know where he is? Margaret's voice had become hard and anxious now. Sweetie shook her head again. I've been trying to find out, she said. I've been trying all I could. Margaret's hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white along the backs. Since you met James? She asked. I tried again last week, Sweetie answered, but it was no use. And I was writing again when you came in. He must be somewhere, and I know I can find him somehow. I shall go on trying, always. Sweetie was crying now, and Margaret put both arms around her. But you do mean to marry James, don't you? She asked, still with the same note of anxiety in her voice. Sweetie paused again before replying. I don't know, she said slowly. I've told him I don't love him, properly, I mean. But he says he doesn't mind. You see, that's the trouble. He loves me, really. And you love him enough to marry him? I suppose so. Well, be careful. Margaret's voice had changed now. Don't go on writing... Don't you go writing no more letters to Ginger, she went on. When you're married, you're not to look at another man. You hear me? Not even at Ginger, if you ever find him. Sweetie turned away. I'm not afraid of myself. Then you should be. Why do you say that? Because I know what happens to you when you're in love with somebody. You do? Yes. And I know more than you think I do about you. I know what goes on inside your mind. That's why I've always tried to bring you up proper. There's a special reason why you've got to be careful. There's bad in you. You look out. I don't know what you mean. Then I'll tell you, Margaret said quietly. Oh dear. I will tell you, Margaret said quietly. I'm your mother. Oh no. There we are. We knew it. We knew it. Golly, I nearly choked up then. I saw it coming. Whew, is that fire on? Turn that off. Sweetie had got up and was facing her. What she saw was a tired, shapeless figure in an old dressing gown, the cheap bedroom slippers, the untidy hair, streaked with grey. I don't believe you, she said. Margaret's eyes were still fixed on her. I wasn't never going to tell you, she said, not ever. But if you feel this way about Ginger, it's better that you know. That's the way I felt about your father once. Sweetie was still standing apart, staring at her. Do you really mean what you just said just now? She asked. Margaret nodded. I can prove it to you if you want me to, she said. I've still got the other bit of card I wrote your name on. I'm the one who called you Sweetie. I called you that because I love you so. Then why did you ever get rid of me? Margaret dropped her eyes. I couldn't afford to keep you. I wasn't never married, you see, she said. That's why I'm warning you. And nobody else must ever know about it. Not James or Dame Eleanor or anybody. It's just our secret. I wouldn't have told you now if things hadn't have been this way, but it's only fair for you. Now you know. Now you know you've got to guard against it." "Do you know my father?" Sweetie asked. Margaret did not answer. She merely shook her head. "Am I like him?" Sweetie asked. Margaret, however, did not answer that question exactly. She seemed temporarily to have forgotten about Sweetie. "He was such a lovely young man," was what she said. She didn't say any more, just slid herself down into the chair that stood by the fireplace and sat staring into the empty grate. It was still like that when Sweetie came over to her. Chapter 64. Margaret avoided Sweetie next morning. There are some things that can be said late at night that are unsayable, that don't bear remembering next morning. And Sweetie herself went out quite early. When Dame Eleanor sent for her, she wasn't there. But it wasn't far that Sweetie had gone, only round to the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital, in fact. Miss Prynne was quite overwhelmed when Sweetie came in. She had always shared Dr. Trump's opinion of Sweetie and had never approved of her in the slightest. Not at the time, that is. So far as she was concerned, Sweetie was simply the girl who had disgraced Archbishop Bodkins. But naturally, Dame Eleanor's interest in her had changed everything. It was all completely different now. It was difficult to believe that there could be anything seriously wrong with a girl dressed as Sweetie was dressed now. So she greeted her warmly. "Oh, this is a lovely surprise," she said. "Just fancy it, Sweetie come back to us. I may still call you Sweetie, mayn't I? I can't tell you how we've all missed you. I must congratulate you. It's been like a fairy tale, hasn't it?" "Just like a fairy tale," Sweetie answered. "Is Canon Mallow in, please?" There was an urgency and impatience about her that Miss Prynne noticed immediately, but even so, she couldn't find Canon Mallow. He was over the infant's side somewhere, talking to the little ones. He came at once, however, as soon as he heard who it was that was waiting for him. He only hoped it wasn't his advice that Sweetie had come for, supposing, for example, that she asked him outright what he thought about marrying the naval chap. What on earth was he going to say? Sweetie jumped in as soon as he came in. "Hello, Canon Mallow," she said. "Hello, Sweetie. I shan't keep you very long. I'm sure you're busy." But Canon Mallow only smiled. "Not really," he said. "They don't really need me here, you know. It's useful to have someone around when Larkin can't be here." He paused. He was sure that Sweetie hadn't come to talk about him or Canon Larkin, and he was just wasting her time. So he started again. "What is it, Sweetie?" he asked. "What can I do for you?" "Do you remember when I came before?" she asked him. Canon Mallow nodded. "You wanted to know the boy's address," he said, "and I wouldn't tell you, I remember. What is it this time?" Sweetie smiled at him. "I wanted to say thank you for not telling me," she replied. "Say thank you for not telling you," Captain Mallow repeated. He was puzzled, frankly puzzled, but Sweetie evidently was trying to explain. "You see," she went on, "at the time, I thought I was in love with him." "I know you did," Canon Mallow answered. "That's why I wouldn't tell you." He smiled self-indulgently at the memory of the deep Levantine cunning that he had displayed. Some people have accused Canon Mallow of that sort of man who is deeply... He smiled self-indulgently at the memory of the deep Levantine cunning that he had displayed. Some people had accused Canon Mallow of being the sort of man who is easily duped. Perhaps he was sometimes, but he had certainly seen right through Sweetie on that occasion. "Do you know, I used to lie awake at nights just thinking about him," Sweetie continued. Canon Mallow smiled again. "Well, never mind," he told her. "You aren't the first girl to have done that. They all do it sometimes. Men do, too, for that matter." Sweetie paused. "But it was you who saved me," she went on, "because if I'd gone on thinking about Ginger—" Canon Mallow flipped his fingers suddenly. Of course, that was it. Fancy forgetting the name. Yes, Ginger. I would never have been going to marry James." "Are you in love with him?" Canon Mallow asked, rather abruptly. Sweetie turned her large dark eyes full on him. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be marrying him, would I?" she asked. And as she said it, Canon Mallow felt the load of doubts and misgivings lifting from his mind. He got up and put his hand on Sweetie's shoulder. "That's all I wanted to hear," he told her. "If a girl's really in love with a man, it's worth all the rest put together." "That's how I feel," Sweetie answered. Canon Mallow began searching for his pipe. This was being a far easier interview than he had expected. "And of course, it's the same for the man," he went on. "A man's got to love a girl in just the same way to be happy." He stopped because something almost like a sob had come from Sweetie. "That's why I came to see you," she said. "That's really what I want to talk about." Canon Mallow broke off his search. His pipe must be somewhere. He'd been smoking it earlier in the morning, but a pipe wasn't important compared with what Sweetie was saying. "Do you think that he doesn't love you?" he asked. "Are you sure? It may only be his manner, you know. A lot of men are shy about showing a girl how much they really love her." "Oh, it isn't James I'm thinking about," Sweetie replied. "I'm not worried about James. Dear James loves me tremendously. It's Ginger." "Ginger? But how does Ginger come into it?" Canon Mallow asked. He was becoming confused again. If only he could found his pipe, it would have been easier. He could think more clearly about important things if he was smoking. "But he does," Sweetie assured him. "Ginger was in love with me once, you see." Canon Mallow shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, mustn't take that too seriously. He was only a boy at the time. He's still only a lad now, for that matter." "He's 19, Sweetie answered. "Well, what of it? He would have got over it the same as you have." Sweetie paused. "I wish I could be sure of that," she said. "You see, I promised to marry him once, and he said he'd wait for me forever. It wouldn't be right if I thought he was still waiting for me somewhere." Canon Mallow patted Sweetie's hand. "I think you're worrying yourself about nothing," he told her. "Those sort of promises don't count for anything." Sweetie smiled. "That's what James said when I told him," she replied. Then the smile vanished. "But I can't feel like that. I feel I've got to break it off properly. If I write and tell him I don't love him any more, then I think I would feel better about it. It won't be an easy letter to write, but I'd rather do it than not. I feel I owe it to James somehow. He doesn't, but I do. I was awake all last night thinking about it." Canon Mallow paused. "Well, let's be sensible about it," he said. He had just found his pipe behind the blotter and was now wondering where the tobacco would be. Don't you think it might upset Ginger hearing from you after all this time?" "I would be very careful what I said," Sweetie told him. "Well, of course you know best," he said, "but we don't want to revive a lot of old memories, do we? That might have the wrong effect." "I'm only doing it so that he shan't be hurt." Yes, of course, I remember now. That's the whole idea, isn't it? Yes." The tobacco had mysteriously come into his hand somehow, as though it had grown up through the tabletop like a mushroom while he'd been sitting there, and as soon as he had started to pack his pipe again, he felt so much better about everything, blander, but not sure of himself. "Well, if you've set your heart on it, I can't see much harm in it now," he went on, carefully emphasising the word now, to show how circumstances had changed everything. "Or much good, for that matter, but it's entirely up to you. Only keep it short and to the point, that's the main thing. He wasn't a very literary kind of boy." "I'll remember," Sweetie promised. Canon Mallow was at the filing cabinet. It was a legacy of Dr. Trump's, this filing cabinet, and because Miss Prynne had kept it up to date for him, it was really quite ridiculously easy to find what he wanted. Take Ginger, for instance. There it was, in front of him. Woods Herbert Ginger, January 24th, 1933, June 12th, 1935, Thetford Farm School, Thetford, Norfolk, 13th of June 1935 to March the 10th, 1936, Fordston Traxter Works, Dagenham, 14th July 1936, Pyramid Motor Garage, Dome Road, Brighton, Sussex. That's the last address, Canon Mallow told her, as he copied it out for her. Pyramid Garage, Dome Road, Brighton. I don't think he's left it. Of course, you could always phone up and make sure. Oh, no, said Sweetie. I think telephoning would be rather difficult. Yes, perhaps you're right, Canon Mallow answered. I wasn't thinking. As he gave the slip of paper to Sweetie, she kissed him. And this pleased Canon Mallow a great deal. It was nice being able to make people so happy, and it was nice finding someone like Sweetie who really cared about someone else's feelings. Most girls in her position would simply have been thinking about getting married. So he kissed her back again. Well, that settles everything, doesn't it? He said, gently. Everything, Sweetie answered. And when she left Archbishop Bodkin Hospital, Sweetie did not return at once to Dame Eleanor's. She went down to the High Street instead and walked over to the cab rank. Victoria, she said. Well, we know where she's going. Oh, blimey, time is ticking on. But look, we've only got a few pages. We've just got to get through these, so bear with us. Cunning little minx, eh? Cunning. Ah, we all see what she's up to. I'm just trying myself not to get too choked up with it. Isn't it amazing how the emotion, it's only words on a page. Find that address on Google Earth. Let's see where they are now. Yeah, that would be interesting. There. Chapter 65. There could be no two opinions on the matter. It was Sweetie's disappearance that finished Dame Eleanor. She never got over the shock of it, or the shame. A sick, tired old woman before it had happened. She went to pieces afterwards. And the way things turned out, she didn't even see Sweetie again, because by the time Sweetie, with a rather embarrassed-looking Ginger beside her, had been found by the Sussex police, it was too late for Dame Eleanor to see anybody. Not that Sweetie had deliberately kept her in suspense. It was not until 10 o'clock that morning when Sweetie saw Canon Mallow, and by 6:30 the same evening the telegraph boy was already cycling along the drive to the Cedars. The telegram itself was simple, terse and laconic. Have found Ginger and am going to marry him, it said. Please explain to James and Dame Eleanor, and don't worry, love, Sweetie. That was all. It was as though in some strange fashion she had never really doubted that things would turn out that way, and was merely confirming what had happened. And from the moment Margaret saw the telegram, she did not doubt what it contained. That didn't mean, of course, that her hands did not tremble when she opened the envelope. She knew that the telegram stood for the complete ruin and destruction of everything that she had planned. It meant that Sweetie would never be a lady now, and that her own last solemn warning, the admission that been humiliating herself in front of Sweetie, had been completely ignored. But as she read, there was another feeling altogether inside her, a fierce, illogical, happy feeling. That telegram was addressed to me, she told herself. I'm the one she turned to. It's me she wanted to know. Dame Eleanor insisted on seeing the telegram, though she just might as well have taken Margaret's word for what she said. There was no question about the telegram. It was from Sweetie, all right. If anyone else had sent it, the telegram might have read, "We are going to be married." As it was, it said, "Am going to marry him." And that was precisely what Sweetie had been saying for the last 12 years. There are two people, a girl and a young man, sitting in a corner of a Brighton cafe. The police were looking for them. They were there seated side by side, and the girl was holding the young man's hand. In front of them on the marble tabletop was a brooch. Sorry, it's quite emotional, this, and quite embarrassing too. Because it's, it all comes. I just need a moment, ladies and gentlemen. I need a moment to compose myself. I will return. One moment, please. Just going to blow my hooter. We will have no more of these emotional books read on this show. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness. In front of them on the marble tabletop was a brooch. The girl had just put it there. "Don't you remember it?" she asked. He picked it up and looked at it, disengaging his hand from hers in order to do so. The brooch was obviously a cheap one. It was of silver gilt in the shape of a shamrock with the word "Mother" inscribed across it. The young man shook his head. "You gave it to me," the girl told him. "That time in Doncaster. I've kept it ever since. Have you got your tie pin?" "What tie pin?" "It doesn't matter." The young man took hold of her hand again. "Don't you worry," he said. "I'll get you a better brooch than that. Something you can really wear. I've got a good job now, I have." No. Dame Eleanor's attack, the first of two really bad ones, came on that night. When Margaret went into her, she thought that Dame Eleanor was actually dying, but Dame Eleanor was not ready for dying just yet. She had too much on her mind. She was sitting up in bed, leaning so far forward that the pillows no longer supported her, and she was trying to speak. Margaret went over and put her arms around her. It was like putting an arm around a child. Dame Eleanor had grown so thin. "You lie still," she said. "I'll fetch the doctor. I'll go for him now." But Dame Eleanor reached out and caught her by the arm, the old fingers fastened there. "Not the doctor," she said. I don't want the doctor. I want..." She was too weak to say more, and for a moment she simply lay there, still feebly holding Margaret's arm so that she would not go away from the bedside. It's Thring I want," she said at last. Margaret looked at the clock. "But Mr. Thring can't come now," she said. "It's too late. I'll get him to come in the morning." "I mayn't be here in the morning," Dame Eleanor replied. "He's got to come now. If I die..." "You're not going to die," Margaret told her. "I'll give you your tablets. They'll make you feel better." She measured out a dose in the little tumbler and held it to Dame Eleanor's lips. "I'll get the doctor first and then Mr. Thring," she said. "You'll want to be strong enough to talk to Mr. Thring when he comes, won't you?" "I want Thring," was all Dame Eleanor answered. "I want Thring. Tell him he's got to come. Say I'm dying and I want him. Say it's about Sweetie." Oh, she's going to cut her out the will. We know what's happening. It was 9:30. How are we doing? Are we all right? We've only got a few more pages. It was 9:30. next morning when Dr. Thring called. And it was obvious that he knew what he was in for. He had his briefcase all ready and a worn and drawn, harassed expression. But he needn't have worried. After last night's attack, Dame Eleanor was now at her quietest and most lucid. There was no need for crossing out and writing over this morning. Dame Eleanor came straight to the point, and it was a simple one: to erase all mention of Sweetie, to make certain that there was no loophole through which any of Dame Eleanor's money might get to her. The only trouble was time. This was will-making, and the scythe... this was will-making with the scythe waiting. Dame Eleanor would not hear of Mr. Thring's going back to his office to get the thing typed out properly, nor would she agree to having a secretary come to the house. Even that was wasting precious, invaluable time, cutting things too fine for her liking. Mr. Thring had to sit down there and then and make a fair copy. It was the doctor and Canon Mallow. He had come round to say that he did hope that he had done the right thing, giving Sweetie Ginger's address, who witnessed it. And as soon as the paper was back in Mr. Thring's briefcase, Dame Eleanor closed her eyes. There was nothing more she wanted, she said. She just to have the light out and to be given another hot water bottle and to be left alone. Margaret sat with her all afternoon. Most of the time Dame Eleanor dozed, but for quite long stretches she lay staring up at the ceiling. They were scattered, muddled sort of thoughts. There wasn't much difference between sleeping and being awake now. People came and looked at her and gave her sips of things and rearranged the bedclothes and went away again. The doctor kept coming. Derek looked in a couple of times, once in his uniform and once in that big checked sports coat of his that she'd never really liked. And he had a different girl on his arm each time. Sweetie came in to say good night. She was looking pale again, Dame Eleanor thought, and seemed to be worrying about something, and that red-haired boy who was always running away, who came to borrow half a crown. At 9 o'clock, the doctor thought that her brother ought to be sent for. But when they came, she didn't appear to know who they were. She was worried by a sort of veil, a thin, invisible cobweb that had drifted across her face, and she kept trying to brush it away. There was one more lucid moment, a complete lucid one, shortly after midnight. The nurse had arrived by now, and it was Margaret who was sitting by the bedside holding Dame Eleanor's hand. Dame Eleanor suddenly opened her eyes and looked at her. "This is just the way I wanted it, dear," she said. "It's such a comfort having you." She paused. "I've been thinking," she went on. We're not really to blame about Sweetie. That's what happens when there's bad stock. If only we knew who the mother and father were, we should probably be able to understand everything." There was a longer pause this time. "Don't you worry, dear," she said. "I remembered you in the will. Dr. Thring knows all about it." Dame Eleanor did not speak again, except to say that she was cold and that the lights were flickering. But it was only a mumble by now, and even Margaret could not make out what she was saying. She sat there with the thin, chilly hand, practically bone already, held tightly in hers, and thought about Sweetie. Perhaps it's better that way, she was trying to tell herself. If she loves Ginger, I didn't ought to ever have tried to stop it, and it's only her father who's different. She's the same sort of Ginger, really. Perhaps it will work out all right. The next thing that Margaret remembered was the nurse telling her that it was all over. She still had Dame Eleanor's hand in hers, but it didn't belong to Dame Eleanor any longer. Are we all right for time? You don't have to hang around. You can always watch the end at some other point, but I might as well just get to the end here. The funeral was over and done with now, and the blinds were up again. But the air of funerals and dissolution still hung about the place. There was a half-finished feeling to everything, as though the house itself were going to be buried next. It was quiet too, with an unnatural tomb-like quietness. The hush of the undertaker's mute still hung about the hush of the undertaker's mutes still hung about the staircase, and in the drawing-room there were dust sheets over the furniture. But it was night-time that it was at its worst. Nobody seemed to have the heart to turn on the lights any longer. Not that there were many of them left to turn on. On the whole... Sorry, I'm beginning to fall apart here. Out of the whole staff, only Margaret and the caretaker remained. Margaret herself had been prepared to go on with the others, but Mr. Thring had stopped it. It had been Dame Eleanor's wish, he said, and the bishop and the judge both confirmed it. They wanted someone, he explained, to go through all Dame Eleanor's personal belongings. Margaret, however, was not thinking of Dame Eleanor any longer, or even of Sweetie. She was thinking of herself. She had heard again from Mr. Thring, and Dame Eleanor had been true to her word. She had remembered her. To my companion, Margaret Hart, 3 months' salary, and the sum of £200 if still in my employ, it ran. And of course that altered everything. She could really begin to live now. It wasn't as though she were old yet, or at least not really old, only just 40. She still felt like a woman. And the letters that she had been getting had always been full of that one idea. Even the last one that had come less than a month ago had mentioned it. If only I could raise the money somehow, I'd send you your fare so that you could come and join me here, it said. I've had enough of knocking around without even a home to come back to in the evenings. And there was more in the same vein. The hotel job didn't turn out quite as I expected, it explained. But I've gone in with one of my own sort now. It's a riding academy, and though yours truly is only a sort of glorified stable boy, the life is all right. See photo enclosed. And don't forget that 2 can live as cheaply as 1 out here. A damn sight cheaper in some respects. All the boarding houses rook you if you're single. So here's still hoping, even though I'm not exactly flush at the moment. Your last £2 was a real godsend. I don't know that I would ever have done it without it. You've been a brick all the way through, and I feel a worm taking your money. There isn't another woman. Margaret put down the letter and took up the photograph. Up against a stable door, it showed a tall, rangy man, still with the same handlebar guard's moustache and the shining, smiling teeth. He was dressed in a sweatshirt, and his body, she noticed, seemed to be dark all over. But that was the only change. The last 20 years didn't seem to have aged him. There wasn't a wrinkle anywhere on his face, just the linings that come from being out in the sun, and the carefree look was still there despite the bad times he'd been through. He's a lovely man, she suddenly said out loud. That's what he is. He's lovely. And it was the reply that wasn't so easy to write, but she blamed herself for it. She should have written to him sooner. As it was, she had to tell him everything. Dear Derek, she wrote, your mother died peacefully last week. I was with her at the end, and she wasn't really in any pain. I can vouch for that. I didn't tell her about us, of course. She died without knowing. It would only have upset her if I'd told her, so I thought better not. Now I've got a big surprise for you, Derek. You've got a grown-up daughter. I swore I wouldn't tell anyone while your mother was still alive. I was only 1 month gone when you sailed, so of course I couldn't be sure. And I never told you because I was afraid you'd do something silly like try and come back, and then you would have been arrested like you said. She's getting married soon, so she won't need me any longer. And Derek, your mother left me £200, and I'm coming out to join you the way we always said I would. It isn't much. It isn't much, third, which means we'll still have something... I don't understand that. It isn't much, third, which means we'll still have something over when I get there. What happens about your allowance, have you heard? Oh, right, and say you're glad. I won't actually sail until you've written, because I want to be sure you weren't just being nice about wishing that I would come, because I really can come now. She broke off because her fingers ached. Writing letters had always been difficult, and this was one the most difficult that she had ever tried to write. Her eyes were burning, and she went across to the wash basin to bathe them. Then she looked at herself in the mirror. On her face there were plenty of lines, and round the mouth too. It was more than lined, it was saggy. There were cups under her eyes that she should have... There were cups under her eyes that she could see as she stared at the image of herself. Frowning only made them deeper, and she turned her head sideways. But then the light caught her hair at the temples, and that was the worst of the dark hair. It showed the grey too. And at the temples there was more grey. There was more than grey. Sorry, I'm reading it craply. She was white. There was white. She bit her lip and went over to the cheval glass, whatever that is. She had put on weight since she had been back at Dame Eleanor's, and the blouse that she was wearing seemed too tight. It bulged. But it wasn't only the bulge, it was the way she was standing. She bulged nowadays, and her shoulders wasn't... But it wasn't only the blouse, it was the way she was standing. She did bulge nowadays, and throwing her shoulders back wasn't the answer either. It didn't feel natural any longer, and she wouldn't be able to keep them like it. Then she looked down at her feet. She was wearing old bedroom slippers. Those bedroom slippers were just what she was made for these days. They were right for a tired, sagging sort of old woman of 40. She turned suddenly and picked up the letter she had written. And when she picked it up, she began to tear it, first into wide strips and then into narrow ones, and finally across and across, so that the sheet of notepaper was like confetti when she dropped it into the basket. He don't want me, not like I am now, she told herself. He wants me like I was when he first had me. I'd rather that's how he went on thinking about me. I don't want to see his face when he finds out. It wouldn't be fair on him. Not when he's kept himself so lovely. Just a page and a bit. We've got to finish. This is the postscript. And it's called The Bus Goes Out of Sight. Both of Margaret's secrets were out by now. You know all there is to know about her child, and about the father of her child. The woman in the raincoat isn't one of London's mysteries any longer. She's putting on her raincoat again at this moment. Not the same raincoat, of course. Even with all her care, the old one wore out about 15 years ago. But it's still the same sort of thing, shapeless and clingy and mildly waterproof. She's got her suitcase, a reddish, hardened cardboard affair with reinforced corners, packed already, and she's drawing on her gloves as she stands there. Her job's over. The 3 months are up and all Dame Eleanor's things are disposed of. It's time she was moving on. Looked at in one way, there isn't much to show for her ever staying there. In her handbag she's only got £3.10 and a picture of Derek that she took from Dame Eleanor's dressing table. She found it right under the lining of the drawer, as though Dame Eleanor hadn't wanted to risk coming upon it suddenly, but couldn't on the other hand bring herself to part with it altogether. The £3.10 is all Margaret's fault, of course. There was £200 ready and waiting for her, but she gave £200 to Sweetie for a wedding present, felt that Sweetie needed it more, and in a way had more claim to it. That's why Margaret's going after another job. It is in a children's home again, and general help is the job, and general help is what the job is called. Not that Margaret minds. She knows just what it means. It means stairs and nappies and floors and crockery and odd cups of tea for sister and a bedroom somewhere right under the tiles again. It's better that way, she keeps thinking. Plenty to do. Keep my mind off myself. Stop me brooding. There is no one except the housekeeper to say goodbye to as she leaves the Cedars. And because she isn't the sentimental kind, she doesn't go round the house having a last look at everything. She just goes straight down the stairs, putting the corner of the mat straight on the hall as she passes it, and out through the big front door, closing it for the very last time. It's a long walk down the drive, and the cardboard suitcase is heavy with all her winter things. But that can't be helped. There is nothing for it but to walk. It's right down to the bus stop that she has to go, and the bus stop is nearly half a mile from Dame Eleanor's. Because of the time of year, it was late summer when Dame Eleanor died, just as she knew it would be. It's getting pretty dark now by tea time, and Margaret had drunk a cup of tea with the caretaker before she left the Cedars. The street lamps are on already, and a faint drizzle that makes the pavements shiny is beginning to come down. While she waits for the bus, she turns up the collar of her raincoat. You can't even see her face any longer. She is just anyone by now. The original mysterious woman in the raincoat, the one we followed, and lost in the darkness, and finally caught up with again. She's the one in the picture. She's the one the picture frame was made for, and the portrait is finished now. Margaret has used up all the emotion in her life. She's got to content herself with the memories of it from now on, and deep inside herself she knows it. If she'd been in any real doubt about the matter, she'd have brought that steamer ticket and gone out to South Africa, white hairs and felt bedroom slippers and all. But the bus is drawing up in front of her, and Margaret is glad to be inside it. The drizzle has turned to rain, and it is coming down properly by now, bouncing off the road in blocks, bouncing up again off the road blocks in real Putney fashion. It is the corner of St. Mark's Avenue where the bus has stopped, but she can't see anything because the windows of the bus are streaming. Then, as the driver moves off, she catches glimpse of the lime trees just outside the gatehouse set in the high stone wall, the gas lamps and the tracks of watery light that lead to them. But that too vanishes, and she is left to the rain and the darkness. She's thinking of Sweetie, and all the time the bus is carrying her away from us. Then the bend in the road comes, and she's gone forever. And there we are. Oh, gosh, that was quite tough at the end. You probably sent an old photo. Yeah, that's true. Derek, please step off the bus. No, bravo. Well, there you go. Thank you very much. Sorry, I got a bit choked up on that. Just goes to show how invested in the characters you can get. And it's all fiction from so long ago. Anyway, I must control myself. But there we go. Tomorrow we will start a new book. If you're up for it, we will start this, which I don't think it's going to be anything like as emotional or as funny, but I'm sure it'll be jolly. It's a shortish book, so we'll be all right. Anyway, sorry to have kept you all that extra time, but we needed to finish it, and it's done. So I will bid you adieu. have a good evening. No Vobe show tonight, and I will catch up with you tomorrow. Look after yourselves, take care, and all the best. Toodle pip.